We can pick from 50 different states, embrace the truth, and we will lay everything on the altar. What if your assumptions about Dayar were completely incorrect? Jonathan Lamb finally speaks out about the network's hidden billion-dollar riches, exposing the terrible reality for the first time. They had covert dealings, power conflicts within, and secrets they want the public to remain unaware of. The dust has finally settled. No, this is more than that. This controversy has the potential to rock the Christian media industry to its very core. Get ready for an explosive expose. At long last, the truth has emerged. The Daystar network was not Jonathan Lamb's only environment growing up. There he spent his formative years. As a little boy, he saw his father, Marcus Lamb, establish a Christian media empire. Marcus saw it more than a mere occupation. We were on a mission. It hit close to home. Even Jonathan was aware that the flame would be passed down from generation to generation. Neither a wish nor an unspoken desire existed. It seemed like it belonged in their family's history. No one was surprised. The road ahead of Jonathan had already been mapped out by the time he was a young adult. Gradually, he was being readied for a leadership role, in addition to both on a spiritual and a practical level. Behind the scenes, he was in meetings and contributing to decisions while appearing on film. He was considered the natural successor by his peers inside the business. Who would step in when Marcus left was always obvious. Plus, when the unfortunate Marcus died away in 2021, the subsequent events were very clear. Everything was in place for the plan to go forward. Jonathan Lamb was more than simply a potential contender. Dayar formally designated him as their future president. Just think about that for a moment. Definitely, positively, and in writing. That kind of opportunity doesn't come knocking too often. Has a billion-dollar budget, a worldwide audience, millions of viewers, and an eager team to follow your lead. Everything was set up such that it would remain in the family. It had more to do with doing a job. It was all about continuing a tradition. Christian radio carrying on the work of his father. It appeared apparent to many persons in his vicinity. The surname belonged to Jonathan. It was a part of it. He was granted permission. Were there any other things to consider? The unknown, board meetings, and power struggles that accompany such a change are par for the course. The outcome, however, was predetermined in this instance. Word got out to everyone that man was Jonathan, and there was a brief moment when it appeared as though the story would play out exactly as the script called for it to. With the dawn comes a new day, a new purpose, and the son assumes control of the father's realm. At that point, we were better prepared. In the past, I begged God, when will Jonathan be ready? During the climax of our wrestling match, looking at it from the outside, it likely appeared ideal. By continuing his father's work and guiding Dayar into the future, Jonathan is carrying on his father's legacy. The story that was anticipated was that one. Frankly, I think Jonathan was also expecting it. It was the culmination of his life's work. After all, he had an intimate familiarity with the company. Ministry was his calling. He adored the locals. The chance also didn't appear out of nowhere. For a long time, he had been preparing for this moment. Something began to change, though, as time went by. Not in the spotlight just yet, but somewhere in the shadows. Jonathan started to experience the position he was assuming carried with it more than simply a heavy burden of duty. Expectations, weight, and pressure were all part of it, and they didn't always mesh with his own beliefs. The heritage was still his to claim, and the road ahead was clear, but the price of accepting began to feel high, richer than he had anticipated. However, at this stage of the plot, nobody knew about that. At this point, it was all hazy at best. Making sure the plan was in place was the only thing that counted. President Jonathan was about to be sworn in. Susie, his wife, had been working as a secondary function as well. The pay was more. The platform had more space. More people were seeing their names than before. It was the ideal change that every family and ministry hopes for, carrying forward a legacy without drama or confusion going ahead. The fact that their story was completely unexpected is due to the fact that everything was set up for them. It was all theirs already. There was no need for them to struggle for it. There was no need for them to provide evidence. All they had to do was step in. Even if it may appear to be a blessing on the outside, what appears to be a weight on the inside can happen from time to time. And it is the beginning of Jonathan's true tale. It wasn't till he received the title that he began to doubt its meaning, truly intended. Nonetheless, at first glance, everything appeared to be in order. Every bit of the promised legacy remained. Nobody could have predicted what was going to happen next on the paved road to power. It appeared at first that things were proceeding as anticipated. The new position had been filled by Jonathan. From the outside, it appeared like the next logical step in Daystar's tale, and the organization was stable. Marcus Lamb's son had succeeded him. The filming had not yet concluded. All of the lights were on. The message continued to reach millions of people all across the globe. However, something wasn't quite right behind the scenes, and Jonathan in particular. Nothing happened in a single day. Everything didn't fall apart at a single catastrophic moment. Calmness and slowness pervaded as stress crept up. One meeting, one talk, one unpleasant sensation at a time. His heart began to ache from the weight of things spoken and unspoken. The emphasis on leadership in Jonathan's new position started to wear thin. It wasn't about preserving anything sacred per se, but rather something. There was a lot of pressure on him to maintain his father's reputation, say the right things, and smile for the cameras, in addition to continuing his father's purpose. Were on board, playing along so as to avoid controversy. There was an implicit expectation of that. A story needed to be followed. Now he found himself in the middle of it all. The responsibilities of becoming the VP of a worldwide Christian network extended beyond trust and foresight. The emphasis was on showmanship. The further he ventured into that realm, the more it began to conflict with his deeply held beliefs. Late at night, Jonathan and Susie would engage in lengthy chats. These discussions were not about brand or strategy. Gathered together, I had to go deep into my soul during these difficult times. Observations, uneasiness, and a developing feeling that something was wrong would all be part of their conversations, not with the general public, but with God and one another. They would weep and wrestle. Truth was meant to be the foundation of their world. However, it began to seem less like an empire of storytelling and more like a system or machine. Dayar, in Jonathan's view, was all about ministering to people, sharing the gospel, and steadfastly obeying God. However, in his new role as leader, he began to notice that many decisions were not motivated by prayer or purpose. Power, public relations, and politics motivated them. He experienced a sense of being tugged in opposite ways. Contrarily, he possessed the weight of upholding his father's reputation, providing effective leadership for the firm, and living up to everyone's expectations of him as a man. Yet he was conflicted because he felt as though accepting all of it would be betraying his very essence. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that guiding Dayar wasn't simply in relation to managing a church. Managing one's image was the main focus. Everything came down to timing, when to speak up, when to keep silent, and when to just go with the flow. It wouldn't matter if the flow was heading in the opposite way. The inner conflict became audible. At that point, Jonathan remained calm. He had no resentment. A broken man, and it's not always the most dramatic kind of breaking. It's not necessarily a breakdown or an explosion. Just lounging on the side of your bed can do the trick sometimes. Repeating the same question to God night after night. Do you truly desire this for me? And not hearing an answer right away. Everything is pushing in on you, and there's nothing but quiet and bewilderment. Even Susie could feel it. Beyond being an encouraging spouse quietly observing, she shared his experience of the trenches and the strain they were under. Uncertainty and worry were internal to her as well. She saw their children and pondered the role models they were presenting. In case, are they teaching them to be submissive, or were they only instructing them in the ways of a system that, in return for safety, required them to remain silent? Avoiding acting was their goal. They were determined to avoid becoming leaders who appeared charismatic on stage, but crumbled when pressed for answers. Behind closed doors, however, it became more difficult to disregard the concessions as they progressed further into their positions. The ease with which things may be rationalized became apparent to Jonathan. Claiming to have knowledge when one is actually terrified, or using strategy when one is actually trying to protect oneself. He had fluency in the language. He was skilled at spinning it. However, he had also experienced being in a state of complete chaos. Even though he felt sick to his stomach at times, Jonathan would sit through meetings and nod his head in agreement. As he stepped outside, a wrench would form in his gut. Curious about his journey and whether his former self, a youngster with dreams of serving God, would even recognize him now. Money wasn't his motivation. He had no desire for stardom. He merely wished to act morally. But acting morally inside, the reality he had inherited, was beginning to feel impossible. Standing in line was a genuine source of stress. Unspoken rules existed. Some topics are off limits. You submit to the system without inquiry. You also refrain from publicly expressing your uncertainties. It would be disloyal of them to do that. It is risky to do it. A betrayal of trust would be that. And for a son like Jonathan, who cherished his loved ones and was grateful for his father's possessions, the most challenging aspect was construction. He preferred not to dismantle anything. He was careful not to alienate anyone, but he also feared becoming completely unrecognizable. It became clear to him and Susie that this was more than a job. It was more than a paycheck. There was an exam. It was a test of their obedience, their character, and their willingness to follow the script, or the still little voice of God that was beginning to gain more and more traction in their hearts. The speaker's voice failed to convey plan. There was no guarantee of security or achievement. However, peace was offered, and the only way they could find peace was to consider leaving, not in defiance, but in submission. To let go, to walk away. That thought frightened those people. How might others perceive this? Is this what the church would say? In what ways might their future be affected? Despite the fear, I knew that staying would require me to fake, so leaving seemed like the only honest choice. Putting up an act was the price of staying. Continuing to construct something that no longer seemed authentic to their beliefs or who they were became the price of staying. No amount of prestige, no amount of legacy, no amount of power in the ministry could ever make Jonathan feel at peace again. Just another cog in a well-oiled machine was not what he was looking for. To be able to look into the mirror and know that he was obedient to God, no matter the cost, was his ultimate goal. The tide turned at that moment. Money was not the issue. Aspiration was not at play. Questions of conscience, calling, and the kind of mark he wished to make on the world were at the heart of it. Furthermore, achieving greater heights would not have contributed to that legacy. Distancing oneself was going to be the building block. And so it was that they made their decision. It was never intended to walk away. No one who had followed Jonathan, Susie, or anyone else the history of Daystar from its inception. There seems to be no way out. A look back at the past, present, and future. Signed and sealed, it was a legal document. The next president of a Christian media empire worth billions was supposed to be Jonathan Lamb. Moreover, nobody anticipated to just leave it all behind him. However, it is precisely what transpired. The choice was deliberate. There was no emotion or haste. It was unpleasant, sluggish, and silent. This decision type something takes shape during introspective moments, heartfelt prayers, restless nights, and drawn-out discussions. Both Jonathan and Susie were aware of the situation they were fleeing. It wasn't your average job. This paycheck was special. All of their hard work paid off. On the path to, through, and to all that the world would deem a blessing. Although they knew it in their hearts, they couldn't stay. As far as onlookers could tell, everyone seemed to have it made. Prominent roles, secure finances, worldwide impact. Plus, for some time, the salaries had increased. There was hope for what lay ahead. In theory, they had the upper hand. No longer was there tranquility within. There was a noticeable change in how the mission felt. The burden of what they were expected to bear, their image, the quiet, the performance was gradually draining them. A challenging question needed to be asked of them. Would we be ready to sacrifice our harmony in order to retain the platform, given how much effort they had put into earning the right to reach their destination? In this mission, Jonathan had spent his entire life. All the while, Susie had been there to support him. They had endured hardships that the majority of people would never know, given their lives for a cause they believed in, and made difficult choices. Finally, after all this time, when they reached the peak, they considered abandoning the climb. Even though most people couldn't understand it, it was crystal clear to them. Their mood was calm. They weren't trying to avoid falling short. They weren't attempting to convey some sort of message, even though it meant giving up everything. They were just attempting to do what they thought God was telling them to do. It was not easy to give it up either. They had a family, a house, expenses, and obligations. They were not met with a huge savings account. Absent a golden parachute and hidden fortune, they were not going to leave Dayar with a windfall of millions. They were taking a leap of faith into the unknown. Because of it, their decision came out as genuine, unfiltered, and human. All signs pointed to their remaining. There are plenty of others who could relate. It had everything: strength, ease, and safety. But then Jonathan and Susie had an epiphany that changed their lives. A good-looking document doesn't necessarily indicate your spirit will benefit from it. Keeping going would have meant gradually losing themselves, but on the inside they knew it was worth it to play the game. Smile for the cameras, collect the checks, and hold the title, giving a little here and there, gradually losing go of their principles. And that just wasn't going to work for them. They opted for the more difficult path. All of a sudden, they just let it go. There was no public outcry, no media frenzy, no blaming, and no spectacular departure. A simple, unwavering, and excruciating yes to God, and a resounding no to everything else. They left in a state of tranquility. Doing the right thing, no matter the cost, is the only way to achieve true peace, not the kind that this world offers, which is associated with ease and control. Not to mention how much it cost them. All at once, the revenues stopped. A mortgage remained outstanding. They still needed to get groceries. Just because they made a daring choice didn't mean life stood still, because they had faith that the God who had prompted them to leave would also lead them through this new phase. They rode the wave. Season. When Susie and her husband first felt the serenity, she said they were willing to do whatever it took, even selling their house, cutting back, budgeting, and downsizing. There was complete and utter surrender, no pride, no resentment in that. Their most sincere aspect became their decision to give it all up. Story. It's simple to declare your devotion to God. It's simple to preach the gospel, share inspirational quotes, and sing the praises. But when the going gets tough, and all your hard work, comfort, and position are laid bare, that's when your true beliefs become clear. Leaving Dayar wasn't the only thing on Jonathan and Susie's minds. Departing from the illusion was the theme. The delusion that one's position in a ministry immediately grants them authority. The blessing is comparable to success. Truth is less important than that picture. They were tired of putting on an act, of dragging about a system that no longer represented them, and of pretending. They walked away quietly. It lacked fury, an act of courage, fearless in a lowly, modest, in a more profound manner, the selfless kind of courage that thrives on respect rather than praise. No bridges were burned. There was no drama created. Simply put, they declared, "We can't do this anymore." Afterwards, they confidently made their way out, ready to face whatever the future brought. At first, nobody got it. Many people still fail to do so. Given how safe it is, why would they abandon it? Most people spend their entire life pursuing after something, so why give it up? Well, it is the main idea. Contrary to popular belief, Jonathan and Susie weren't after the typical thing. Something more profound, everlasting, and truthful was what they sought, and there was a cost for being truthful. Yet, independence was also a part of it. Real freedom, not the kind you pretend to have. The type that arises from the realization that your soul has remained unharmed, regardless of everything you have left behind. On occasion, that is the most precious possession one can possess. Long ago, those in charge of there has been a specific appearance of ministry, particularly on large stages. In most cases, it is well-mannered, self-assured, articulate, and authoritative. Strong, sure, and motivating qualities are expected of leaders. They should be confident, firm, and never exhibit any signs of weakness. Leadership begins to resemble more business than faith in large ministries that have access to money, media, and influence. No longer were Jonathan and Susie Lamb typical. The truth is that they were reluctant to do it. It wasn't because they were dissidents or plotters, but because they started to see that having a microphone in hand isn't necessarily the mark of genuine leadership that brings glory to God. Occasionally, it appears as if you are quietly stepping down, but no one knows why. Their decision was exceptionally rare because of that. In Jonathan's expected to succeed Dayar as president. Name, history, experience, and, most crucially, the formal plan were all in his possession. He was the obvious pick. It was obvious to everyone around him he was spared the sacrifice of fighting for role. For the majority, that would have been confirmation that it was already his. Surely, this is the will of God. However, Jonathan had a different perspective. Things were different in Jonathan's eyes. His more experience in leadership roles, the more he began to address difficult issues, rather than the work itself. I was thinking about the state of leadership in that field. Was helping other people truly the goal? Or was it some other goal of power holding? Was it about maintaining a public persona or being honest in daily life? Did it revolve around adhering to tradition or following God? It seemed like something had gone missing the more he searched. Submerged beneath the surface of branding, public relations, and politics were the initial goals and objectives of spreading truth, love, and the gospel. He felt it. Having a title isn't a prerequisite for leadership. Being true is the key. In order to remain true to the truth, he was prepared to sacrifice the title. Particularly in the Christian community, such style of leadership is foreign to the majority of people. Media where success hinges on reaching more people and keeping their attention. Leadership, however, was not about who could command the largest audience or speak the loudest. As Jonathan and Susie came to see, whoever could live the most truthfully would win. And that's when nobody was observing. They had no plans to launch a new venture or establish their own identity. They weren't bolting to found a rival platform or start a new ministry. They merely desired a life that was in harmony with their principles, religion, and tranquility. And that required giving up something that the majority of people would have clung to. Leadership like that isn't showy. It stays out of the news. There will be no cheers for it, but it's genuine. Such candor is much required in the modern world, due to the fact that a great deal of it's exhausting for leaders. Many people are unable to escape systems that discourage openness and want flawless performance. The fear of losing one's power makes many people reluctant to speak the truth. It was a burden that even Jonathan and Susie felt. However, rather than they allowed it to mold them before stepping away, they demanded an end to acting and putting cowardice ahead of principle. And by doing so, they demonstrated an alternative. They proved that leadership requires selflessness at times. Loss is a factor at times. When you realize that what you've established is no longer in line with God's will, sometimes it means abandoning it all. And that is both difficult and sacred. Because he was too weak, Jonathan stayed. He had the intestinal fortitude to leave, since he knew staying would have led to his gradual transformation into someone he wasn't. The strain was too much for Susie, so she stayed put. She decided to separate herself so she could be an honest parent to her children. Don't, instead of merely talking about it on stage, put your words into action at home. It's the unsung heroism that makes a difference, but no one ever notices.